Good morning. I'm Frans Lanting, and it's my pleasure to lead off the Optic West Conference and to welcome all of you to Monterey Bay, which is a very special place because of the people, because of its nature, and also because of its connections to photography. And that's what I'm going to talk about with you. I've lived here for more than 40 years, and I consider it a real privilege. This is what makes Monterey Bay so special. Whales lunch feeding with gulls hovering overhead, fish spilling out of the mouths of the whales, and sea lions to try and grab some fish on the go. Everything is there, and this is all happening within sight of the shoreline. Not many places in the world where you can see this. Flip Nicklin may experience it in his front yard in Alaska, but not many places where you can experience this. And when you come out with us tomorrow morning, you may have a chance to see this for yourself. We're going to learn a lot about f-stops and shutter speeds and ISO settings in the course of this conference, but I'm going to focus my talk on something else. These f-stops are important, no doubt, but I'm going to show you in the course of my talk how you can connect your work with the rest of the world. I'm going to talk with you about how I use photography to establish a sense of place, apply a sense of purpose, and how you can make your photography a step towards becoming part of a community. I never thought, when I was growing up, spending my student days in this gritty, working-class neighborhood in Rotterdam, that I would be so lucky to stand here today, that I would be so lucky to experience these whales lunch feeding. It was a different world. I've always had a passion for nature. And I would escape from these dense neighborhoods in the city of Rotterdam to the beaches along the North Sea, and that's where I began to practice photography, way back when. I'm self-taught as a photographer. I made all my own mistakes, and believe me, there have been quite a few. And I started playing with black and white photography, developing film, doing prints. I like this really grainy aspect of this landscape. And that is where I had my first encounters with wildlife. Now, I had no clue how you would practice wildlife photography back then. There were no books, there was no internet, so everything was trial and error. Dead gulls were much easier to get close to. And this image was my tribute, my way of expressing empathy with a creature that had passed on. A big step from that dead gull on that beach in the Netherlands to this. I like to get eye to eye with the animals that I photograph, both physically and mentally. I want to show their point of view, and I want to give viewers a sense of the world that they're part of. In this case, it's a wandering albatross with wingspan of up to 11 feet, and he is trying to impress a female who's saying, "Big deal, I got these same wings." I learned a lot about the craft of visual storytelling from the lady behind this massive desk. Her name is Mary Smith. She was a legendary photo editor at National Geographic, and that visitor chair was the place where she received all the greats of our time. Jacques Cousteau, Louis Leakey, Jane Goodall, and so on. And I ended up in that same visitor chair, more than a little bit intimidated, as you can imagine. Mary taught me so much, and along with her other colleagues at the Geographic, I learned how to start using photography for visual storytelling. And that led to a whole string of stories in the magazine, lots of covers, and you probably have seen quite a few of these over the years. A heroic lifestyle, it's a dream job, right? To go off for months at a time, to spend time with emperor penguins on sea ice, but let me tell you, it's cold. And it's tough. And you'd better come back with the results, because the director of photography at National Geographic was fond of saying things like, "We publish pictures, not excuses." And there was a sign on his door that said, "Please wipe your knees before entering." Now, that was a joke. But when you first arrived there for your first appointment, it didn't seem so humorous. Months at a time in the field, how do you keep track of what you're doing? I developed a Polaroid back extension of one of my cameras, and then periodically I interrupted what I was doing to shoot a Polaroid, and I would laboriously write down the settings on the back of that piece of Polaroid. Meanwhile, the film would be shipped off, and it would be weeks before I would hear anything back. Now, for those of you who grew up with digital photography, this seems awfully primitive, right? But those were the tools of the day. Things changed for me after I met Christine Ekstrom at National Geographic, where she'd been a staff writer in the books division for a number of years. After we became a team in life and work, things changed. Chris is sitting here in the front row, and normally we present together on stage, but today it's just me because this is a photography occasion. But if you want to hear us speak together, consider coming to Stanford next Wednesday or join us next Saturday in Santa Cruz, where we're doing a big program. Just go to our Instagram or our website and you'll find more details. But back to what changed. Chris started off as a writer, I started off as a photographer, but then we started teaching each other. I learned more about writing, I taught her visual skills, she became a videographer, and these days, of course, we finish each other's sentences, in life as well as in work, because we do the writing together. It's a really unusual process. We help each other over the bumps, in all respects. And in the course of that teamwork, we began to do things differently. We began to do things more independently. We started producing books, which gave us a chance to develop longer narratives with a more personal point of view than stories that were assigned by National Geographic magazine. I've seen a lot of change in the natural world since those early days on that beach in the Netherlands. I captured this image of bulls standing by a water hole in Botswana with an October moon rising as a tribute to the timeless quality of elephants in Africa. Small detail, I stood up to this far in muddy water with elephants behind me and off to the sides, because I was after that perfect reflection. This is perfection beyond belief. But these days, the world of elephants is shrinking. No more freedom to roam. Elephants need to roam between dry season areas, wet season areas, but there's all these obstacles in the way. People, their infrastructure. When this safari lodge in Zambia decided to add an extension to their buildings, they cut off the approach route for elephants to reach a favorite mango tree in the courtyard. The elephant said, "No problem, we'll just walk through the lobby," without a reservation. So it may seem funny, but it is actually quite poignant. And of course, this is happening not just to elephants in Africa, this is happening to wildlife habitat around the world. In Borneo, where Chris and I worked, when I was making this image, we could hear the bulldozers in the background. We all love to connect with nature. I think it's something really deep inside us. Professor E.O. Wilson wrote a whole book about it called Biophilia. We want to connect with the beauty, the harmony, and the completeness of nature on a very visceral level. And I think that is what drives many nature photographers to pursue that, to capture that, and then to share it. And that's what I've done for many years as well. Emperor penguin chicks on sea ice off Antarctica. Hard to think of anything more adorable, but it isn't like that anymore. The last time we went back to Antarctica, The ice is giving way to mud, and the snow is giving way to rain. These are not emperors, these are chinstrap penguins, but the changes still amount to the same catastrophe in the making. Just 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service finally declared emperor penguins an endangered species, and we actually contributed to the information that was presented to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in my photographs. So we hope it's a good thing, but now they're qualified to be recognized as part of new policies that the U.S. has to follow when it comes to climate change. I'll come back to climate change later on. But I'd like to switch to Monterey Bay. Very special place. Chris and I have been coming back from assignments abroad year after year, and then we have a chance to compare what we have here with what we experienced elsewhere. Now, this is not a pristine ecosystem like the Okavango Delta is. A lot of people live here. What you can see in this image, that shoreline that ends up at the Monterey Peninsula on the north. And then the coastline disappears in the upper right, and that's where Big Sur begins. But you see there's a lot of human activity. There's a lot of agriculture, urban development, and so on. But at the same time, it is a grandiose place where land and sea connect in a way that we know no equivalent of elsewhere on the planet. And we've talked with a lot of experts, and nobody's been able to point to another place where land and sea meet in quite the same way. This is the Big Sur coast, by the way, on a morning when all the ingredients came together for an atmospheric photograph like this. The density of marine wildlife in Monterey Bay is unparalleled. This is extraordinary. This is a beach with sea lions and elephant seals at the northern tip of Monterey Bay at a place called Año Nuevo. You'd have to go to the edge of Antarctica, to a place like South Georgia Island, to find anything equivalent. How many of you have been to South Georgia? Lucky few. So you know what I'm talking about. The density is unparalleled. The number of species of seals and sea lions and whales, and the sheer numbers. And they congregate here because of the same reason they congregate at South Georgia Island, because the water is so cold and it is so nutrient rich. But onshore, it is just as intricate. This is an aerial view on the northern end of Monterey Bay, and you can see all these valleys and meadows and woodlands. There are all these ecological niches that support rare and endangered species. We have coastal streams that start in the hills, and they're vital arteries that connect land and sea. And they support migratory fish like coho salmon. The southernmost salmon in the world spawn here in Monterey Bay, along with their close relatives, the steelheads. I made this image using a split view camera, an underwater camera adapted for showing things both underwater and above water. And I use a specialized macro wide-angle lens to make this image of a very large salamander. But using that lens made it look even bigger. This is a unique species known as the Santa Cruz giant black salamander. Occurs only in a few spots. We started this project about Monterey Bay, applying all these techniques that I had learned from working abroad, and it was a real pleasure, but it was also a special challenge to reveal these creatures that exist here. I applied camera traps. One of them was adapted for capturing infrared black and white. I set it up at a trail where I knew animals would come and go. Nice scenic background, and one day, this was captured. A young bobcat mother with a kitten strolling along in midday, dappled sunlight, and the big cats too, the mountain lions. I could show you a whole gallery with the pigs, the deer, the birds, and so on. This is where we are, Monterey Bay. Now, different people will define it different ways, but the simplest way for us to recognize Monterey Bay is not just as a place name on a map offshore. We draw a circle around it, a 50-mile circle, with Moss Landing at the center. And then you see it touches Big Sur in the north, Big Sur in the south, Half Moon Bay in the north. We go all the way inland to the Diablo Range, and offshore we include that amazing phenomenon known as the Marine Canyon of Monterey Bay. 2.5 miles deep. It's deeper than the Grand Canyon. And you don't have to go very far offshore to go straight down and a long way down before you hit the seafloor. And that is one of the reasons why this place is so special. But look at all these mountain ranges running parallel to the coast. I could talk about this map for quite a while, but we have to move on. But here you see the lay of the land. Let me tell you about the seasons. David talked about the fog. I'll explain the fog in a bit. Our seasonality is different here. It really confuses people who arrive from elsewhere. There's no weather, people say. The weather's always the same. And other people say, no, we have 4 seasons every single day. You always layer, no matter where you go. Our spring comes with poppies blooming, but they get blown apart by the spring wind. That spring wind is so strong that it blows grooves, it sculpts the vegetation along our coastline, as you can see here. And it is that wind that is the engine that drives the whole system. It's the wind that brings the whales. That's why we chose that as the subtitle for our book. When that wind begins to blow, it stimulates cold water to rise up from the deep. It blows away the surface layers. Upwellings begin, full of nutrient-rich water, and when they're exposed to sunlight, the food chain begins. Plankton, explosion, and that fuels everything from krill to blue whales. And is also responsible for the fog. When that cold water ends up at the surface of the ocean, where it touches the shoreline, blankets of fog begin to form. And when that fog moves inland, because it gets really hot in the interior, in the Salinas Valley, you get this. Blankets of fog. It's like a horizontal, slow-moving rain. And it moisturizes everything, from the redwoods to the agricultural fields, to our cities, to the skin of our women. Monterey Bay attracts migrants from all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of migratory seabirds arrive here every summer from New Zealand. They're called sooty shearwaters. They fly from New Zealand to Japan to Alaska, and they arrive here to fatten up before they fly back to New Zealand again. Sea turtles swim to Monterey Bay from Indonesia to eat jellyfish here during the summer. Monarch butterflies flutter in from all over the American West because the winters are benign. It doesn't freeze so much. But unfortunately, because of habitat loss and pesticide use farther inland, their population has plummeted by 95% in the last 30 years. They're now officially an endangered species. I never thought we'd see that in our time. I love doing this. I love being in the moment, intersecting myself with birds on the move, a flock of sanderlings on their way from the Arctic to Patagonia. Here today, gone tomorrow. But being in the moment, even though it's exciting, and it is what wildlife photography's appeal is, it's just one dimension of practicing photography here in Monterey Bay. I want to talk with you about influences. Who has influenced me? This, for starters. How many of you are familiar with this book? Not Men Apart. Only a handful. So I'm glad I included it in the show because this was a landmark photo book about the California coastline. Photos of the Big Sur coast. Poetry by Robinson Jeffers. But look who's on the title page. Ansel Adams, Win Bullock, Elliot Porter, Edward Weston, Philip Hyde, Bill Garnett, and so on. A who's who in early environmental photography, all pulled together by David Brower. Who remembers David Brower? Only a handful. David was a man with a passion for nature, and he had a vision about what he wanted to achieve. And he came up with the idea to use photography in the service of conservation. And he, simply put, came up with the concept of coffee table books celebrating nature for environmental campaigns. That seems commonplace now, but it was a brilliant innovation when David started doing that, and Not Men Apart was one of the first books. So I welcome you to look up David Brower and the books he's published. It influenced me greatly when I first saw this book, and that gave me the idea that maybe one day I could start doing similar things. Ansel Adams, one of the greats who lived and worked here. He lived south of Point Lobos for many years. This is one of his images of the Point Lobos coast. Win Bullock, not quite as well known as Ansel Adams, but they were peers. Win, among many things, was known for portraying the grandeur of the coast and the redwoods and then posing models, young and old. One of Win's images, one that I'm not showing here, was responsible for influencing me to make this image of retreating tides on a coastal reef, mixing the early light of before dawn with the first warm light, and then you get this lovely mixing. Blue to purple to yellow and orange. Thank you, Win. My tribute to a redwood forest. What do you think's going on here? Cross lighting. I could not have made this image if I hadn't known about this painting. Albert Bierstadt's a celebrated landscape painter from the 19th century. And from him, I learned about the significance of cross lighting. It creates depth. Look back at this one. I had to use 6 assistants hiding behind the trees with lights to create a similar effect. Foreground, middle ground, background. Thank you, Albert. Opposite effect. Not creating depth, flattening things out using a longer lens. Everything is in the same plane. This is not about depth, this is about light and color. Thank you, Georges Seurat. Pointillist. Read up on what Seurat and his colleagues found out about the use of these kind of pointillist effects to represent light and color. Painters have been way ahead of us photographers with their insights in nature. I created this abstraction of a piece of local geology with this in mind. Starry night. Thank you, Vincent. To the north of Monterey Bay, there's a famous surf break. We have lots of good waves here in Monterey Bay. We have lots of surfers too. But this one is very special. Mavericks at Half Moon Bay. Only the bravest of surfers dare to ride it. Most photographers stay on the other side, but I wanted to get this view. I wanted to capture the luminosity of the wave. The skipper of that raft was not that happy with that decision. Because it's kind of shallow, there's lots of rocks. He said, how long do you want to stay here? I said, well, anyway, it did work out. High shutter speed, because I wanted to render motion the way Hokusai had done. The most famous wave in art history. When the tide goes out, all these wonders become revealed at the tide line around Monterey Bay. Tide pool in Point Lobos. I'm not going to talk to you about the limpets and everything else in there. But what I heard in my head was John Steinbeck. It is advisable to look from the tide pool to the stars and then back to the tide pool again. It is John's way of making the connections between the universe and what exists at your feet. Steinbeck was influenced by the man he's paying tribute here. Knowing Ed Ricketts was instant. After the first moment I knew him better than I knew anyone. Those two struck up a friendship that became really significant. Ed Ricketts comes through in the pages of Steinbeck's writing. Ed Ricketts was a visionary, an ecologist before his time, a marine biologist who had a lab on Cannery Row. That lab is still there. It's this old wooden building. If any of you go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium while you're here, which I strongly recommend you try and do, you'll pass by this building. It's still there. The doors are closed. The lab's still there the way Ed left it. Without Ed Ricketts, I'm not sure there would be a Monterey Bay Aquarium today, because it was the marine biologist who clustered together and gathered with the Packard family who came up with this vision for a new aquarium that would be based on the riches of Monterey Bay. Thank you, Ed. I'm talking about collaborative creativity here today. Each of us starts off alone, but if you start thinking of the connections you can make with other artists and with activists and with scientists, you can do way more than you can do if you're just looking at the shutter speed and the apertures on your camera. When Brett Weston made this photograph, another one that influenced me deeply, there were very few photographers here. He was a pioneer in the way he saw, the way he celebrated the Big Sur coast at Garapata Beach. And I've stood there myself to commune with nature. This grandiose way of land connecting with ocean. And you can feel like a hero there when you're by yourself on an early morning. But these days, photography is all about sharing the experience. Thanks to digital photography, we can capture and share images instantly. And it's the reason you all are here. Because you're not just soloists, you have become members of a community. I love teaching photography. I love passing on life lessons and lessons I've learned from holding cameras in my hands for decades. And I love inspiring people to grow and making them do things that they've never thought of doing before, whether it is to think of other combinations of settings or artistic concepts. So we teach workshops here periodically around the Monterey Peninsula. I'm going to share a couple of images from the most recent session. Peter Joseph did this in the same beach where Brett Weston stood with a camera that can do so much more. And here you see the secret settings. Try to keep that ISO low and extend the shutter speed. And Peter is actually in the audience. I didn't even know that. Peter, where are you? There you are. Great image, man. Meng Ying, same place, totally different composition. Used color instead of black and white conversion. Settings are good. ISO 4000, she forgot to reset that. The image would have been a little bit more detailed if she'd brought it down to 100. Ravi said, ocean, who needs ocean? I like the plants. Jay Mizell once said, if you think things look good in front of you, look over your shoulder, look behind you. Wisdom. Intricate plant life. Great setting, F29, extended depth of field, everything was done right. And then I noticed in that same direction, this guy. He was a volunteer for state parks, eradicating exotic plants, the ice plant that looks good in spring, but it really smothers all of our native plants. So we need volunteers like David to do that. There's always a new point of view. You can be really intimidated by all the tripod holes that Ansel Adams and Wynne and Edward and Brett left here along the coast. And I'm not even talking about others, all of you. There's always a new point of view. Every time I take people out, it is amazing what Julie did. I had not seen that before. Thank you, Julie. In our Bay of Life project, we're embracing the work of other photographers because it makes the project more complete. It expands the range. And by the way, I'm from Holland, so I'm a little bit leery to go underwater too much. Patrick Webster is a master at lighting, and here he captured the resurgence of a kelp forest. Chase Decker is a specialist in capturing marine mammals in motion. This is not easy. You could go out 100 times and not see this happen, let alone that you're there with the right settings to do this when the dolphins surface. So thank you, Chase. Amazing image. And these two previous images are included in our book, by the way. I don't know the settings here, but I think it's about 1,000. When you go farther down, life becomes surreal. Scientists from Mbari, the research institute affiliated with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, have pioneered technology of robotic submersibles that go way, way down. And they see things like this vampire squid, which is neither a vampire nor a squid, but that's one of these deeper stories. And then at the bottom of Monterey Bay, things like this. A dead whale had sunk to the seafloor, and then it became a banquet, a feast that's been going on for years, attracting deep-sea octopi and weird fish and bone-eating worms. Amazing. Yet another one of these fantastic stories. I could talk with you for hours about Monterey Bay. You get the idea? But we need to move on from the natural history to the environmental history. People have lived here for more than 10,000 years. 10,000 years. They were tending the bay. The biodiversity that we praise today around Monterey Bay was a mosaic of foodscapes for people who made their living off the land and the sea. And they left their imprints in places like this. The secluded cave deep in the Big Sur wilderness, painted handprints that were solidifying initiation ceremonies about which we really do not know much because their culture was completely disrupted after Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1770s, forced indigenous people to cluster around the missions. They died from disease. It was a horrible period. And a culture that had coexisted with nature here came to an end in a matter of 2 generations. But it's not the end of the story. Native Americans are refinding their way back into Monterey Bay, are reestablishing themselves and putting new footprints on the landscape. A year ago, Chris and I were honored to be invited by the Amamutsan people to document a ceremony that had not been performed in 250 years. Every year, around this time, when the first rains come and the streams begin to rush towards the ocean again, the salmon start gathering offshore. They want to swim upstream. It's their nature. And onshore, people like the Amamutsan would gather to sing them upstream, to welcome them back. Had not been done in more than 2 centuries. But because a dam had been removed on a coastal creek and new habitat was restored, the Amamutsan were invited to sing the salmon back. Linda Yamani, who lives not far from here, has revived the language of her ancestors, which very few people knew how to speak anymore. She's from the Rumsen tribe, and she's also single-handedly revived the fine art of basket weaving. She literally had to go buy small pictures, JPEGs, from museums in Russia, because there's only a handful of these original baskets left. She took us to her favorite spot where the plants grow that make the finest baskets. Talk about a sense of place. Things changed when white people arrived here. A period of plunder began. For a couple of decades, the main commerce along this part of the coast consisted of slaughtering marine mammals, whales and seals and everything else. Well-heeled citizens from Monterey are witnessing the flensing of a humpback whale. In 2 generations, all these animals disappeared. 2 generations. Same thing happened with the sardines. The sardines that gave rise to Cannery Row and all these enterprises. Ed Ricketts was warning them. This is not sustainable. And nobody paid attention because the profits were too big. Redwoods. After the gold rush, everybody needed construction wood. And in a matter of 2 generations, the original redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains were cut into pieces. Add another wave after the earthquake and the fire in 1906, and then the turnaround began. Activists from the San Francisco Bay Area banded together and established the Sempervirens Fund. In the nick of time, they managed to save the last big redwood standing in Big Basin. It became the first state park in California. Hallelujah. They looked very well heeled, but they were the original tree huggers. And thanks to them and many others, we have ancient redwoods standing within a 1-hour drive of millions of urban residents in the San Francisco Bay Area. But it's not just the tree huggers that are part of this story as we're presenting it. We need the wisdom and the practical knowledge of people who are making a living off the land and the sea, the people with dirt under their fingernails. They have their own wisdom. Bud and Lud McCrary established a logging company after the big trees were long gone and people thought they were crazy. And yet they managed to find a way to harvest redwood trees sustainably. And they became radicals who taught the California Department of Forestry that their standards were too lax. Tighten up. This is a better way to do it. Thanks, Lud and Bud. We need people like this guy, Dave Straub, supporting steelhead. Isn't that a magnificent fish? Okay. At a hatchery north of Santa Cruz. Elephant seals, slaughtered. There was almost none left 100 years ago. And then they were given protection first by Mexico, and then 50 years ago, this year, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was established in Washington, D.C. And then the Endangered Species Act. And thanks to that, elephant seals have made a comeback. And they're coming ashore as we speak for their winter rituals. Peregrine falcons, the fastest birds on Earth, could not escape their fate because of the effects of DDT. Thinned their eggshells, crushed their chicks. But in 1973, DDT was banned, thanks to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published 8 years prior to that. California condors went down the same path, close to extinction, in part because of lead poisoning, lead shot, animals killed, they feed on the carcasses, gone. They've been rewilded. Now there's more than 100 flying free along the Big Sur coast. And it all adds up to a success story that is pretty unique. But it didn't happen automatically. It didn't just happen naturally. And with an election coming up in a few days, it's really worth keeping in mind that, yes, politicians can make a huge difference. If we elect the right people, we can do this again. Because of the right decisions made 50 years ago, we are benefiting from the results every day here. It's improved our quality of life hugely, and it's enabled creatures like these to bounce back, including mountain lions. Given protection while Ronald Reagan was governor in the state of California due to lobbying. But mountain lions have a hard time dealing with our human infrastructure, especially roads. This one tried to cross Highway 17, was killed by a car, taken to a lab for forensic analysis. Chris and I are very proud that we convened the first meeting of stakeholders to explore what could be done. Was there a place where an underpass could be created to enable lions to traverse from the northern part of the Santa Cruz Mountains to the southern part of the Santa Cruz Mountains? A few weeks ago, there was this ceremony. It's finally happening. It takes a long time to bend things around. It took the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County many years of lobbying and financial campaigns, and it took the efforts by Senator John Laird and other politicians in Sacramento to twist the arm of Caltrans. But now they really like what they're doing there. And this is becoming a template for other parts of California. And we're going to see a lot more of these underpasses and overpasses to heal the landscapes. The Land Trust of Santa Cruz County just purchased this property to create more connectivity between the Santa Cruz Mountains in the north and the Gavilan Range to the south. And we have other partners we're working with. Watsonville Wetland Watch is creating trails along an urban wetland, important for birds, migratory birds, but also hugely important for people who live in densely packed cities. And most of the population there is Hispanic. So we're working with them on their next initiative to regreen Watsonville. The ugly word, the scary term, climate change. I never thought that we would see this happen so fast, so close to home. Chris and I are educated. We work with lots of environmental organizations. But the effects of climate change turned from an intellectual concept into a scary reality when the CZU fire hit us 2 years ago. It burned down to the beach. Nobody thought that that would happen. The Santa Cruz Mountains were thought to be impervious to fire. Foresters called it the asbestos forest. Nope, it burned. All of Big Basin burned. A few months earlier, we stood there at the top of these hills that were burning in that previous image with ecologist Gray Hayes, because the place is full of endangered and unusual plants. And of course, I never thought that this image would become part of history, because it'll never look the same, certainly not within our lifetime. Here's a short video clip that we made when we went back into the burned area with state parks. There had not been a forest fire in Big Basin in hundreds of years of this extent because of fire suppression. Native Americans used to burn all the time. It was part of their way of managing the landscapes. But after they were kicked off the land, that practice, that knowledge was stopped, and we need to bring it back. After I made that image, Chris and I rushed back because we thought we might lose our home. and we panicked and tried to do what we could. The sheriff showed up and said, "You got to get out, the fire is coming," scared everyone. And then we talked with neighbors, and we decided to stay. We were not so sure authorities would have our backs once we would leave our properties. And we have a strong neighborhood, and we have capable people. So we created our self-defense, and we fought the fire. And we managed to save our neighborhood. But many people were not so lucky. 1,000 families lost their homes in that CZU fire in 2022, including our friends Matt and Ann Rowley in Swanton, lost everything they had. They faced a daunting prospect of rebuilding, like so many other families. So many hoops to jump through, insurance companies, new regulations. And it's a really sorry statistic to share with you that 2 years after the fire, from the 1,000 fire victims, less than 50 have started to rebuild. Many won't do it at all. They can't face the reality of it. Matt and Ann are now climate refugees. They've moved north. And that's one of the big stories of our time. Nature's turning against us because we're turning against nature. No matter whether you get hit by a hurricane or by a flood or by a fire, it's an expression of nature being out of balance with us, or we being out of balance with nature. And we need to resolve that. Fires turning into firestorms. We need these winter storms to come off the ocean every year. In fact, we're dangerously dependent on a handful of winter storms here to replenish our water supplies. It's totally unpredictable. Depends on obscure weather patterns in the middle of the Pacific, and then they come ashore, giant waves. Peter Mell, local surfing hero, loves them. But can we count on these waves? Can we count on these storms to continue as we need them? That's the big question here. We need the rain. We need the fog to keep the forest green. And I'm glad to experience these first rains. It may not be what you had in mind when you came here. You might have been thinking about sun, but thank God we have some initial rain. This is how I captured it on our meadow. We live in Bonnie Doon at the northern end of Santa Cruz. And the longer shutter speed, that visual line. The rain is a very difficult thing to express in photographs. And we need the fog. The fog is our air conditioner. Without fog, farmers would be in serious trouble here. It's an unpaid ecosystem service. So Chris and I have been exploring Monterey Bay the way we've done it elsewhere. And after a couple of years, we suffered from the same syndrome that scientists and technocrats suffer from. We had all the facts and figures. But how do you turn that into a story? Joseph Campbell, another friend of Ed Ricketts, and John Steinbeck, who also lived here in Monterey, put it this way. He said, people forget about facts. They remember stories. And that's a takeaway for all of us. So we tried to do this. Simplify the complexities, and we created this. And if I can remember this, no, I can't quite. I should know this by heart now. But here's the most simple way to express what Monterey Bay is all about. The Bay of Life is a unique confluence of land and sea, energized by the sun, here in the middle, shaped by the forces of fog and fire, and influenced by the actions of people. That's the story. We started playing with these ideas the way we always do. Yeah, we don't agree about everything, but gradually something takes shape, and it's just the two of us. We try things out, ask friends to comment, but it's just nurtured, very close to our hearts. And now it's a real thing. We've published a book. Here we're doing presentations like this one here. Thank you for attending. But now the rubber needs to meet the road. It's no longer just the two of us. We need all of our partners to become part of the story. So I'm really glad that B&H has given me the opportunity to evangelize about Monterey Bay here. Thank you, Manny. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone else. And we say thanks to all these other organizations and companies. We're really thrilled that the Santa Cruz County Office of Education, which manages our school system, is embracing the book and turning it into a new curriculum for students across the county. In English and Spanish, I should say. We have plans to publish the book in Spanish. And the organizations go on. So I'd like to end the presentation by sharing a short video clip with you, because of course we're also producing video. And this is just a few clips here and there that we're weaving into the exhibitions and other presentations. So, and I'll explain a few more things about what we're trying to do while you see these lunch-feeding whales gulp the fish in front of you. We really want to make a difference with this project. It's for people of the region. We want to start from the ground up, educate our kids, and share with them how special this place is, how it was pulled apart, and how it's been brought back, and how there's a coexistence here of sorts. Here's the famous peregrine falcon. This is not just a story for people here in Monterey Bay, because there's no more pristine nature on the planet, as I mentioned earlier. We need to start healing our planet place by place. And if Monterey Bay can be healed, then we hope that this is a story of hope for people elsewhere. Here's Matt Rowley, still working with the fish even after he lost his home. And we need these stories of hope, because there's a lot of bad news every single day. We're at the beginning of a new climate change conference in Egypt. Don't despair. Don't despair. There are people who are really trying to make things happen in Egypt, and we can all do our part. The big redwoods in Big Basin, scorched by the fire. The flames went 200 feet up in the air. And we thought these redwoods were gone. No, they came back. And State Parks is now proactively applying fire the way Native Americans did, with prescribed burns. The people who are running cattle in the uplands are providing habitats that's corridor for wildlife. That's a little bit too close for comfort, I would say. And then, as the best expression of this grandiose meeting of land and sea, the big waves. And a surfer paying tribute. She's just watching. Happy to be there, like we all are. So you can see a lot more on bayoflife.net. Check it out. You'll see more of our partners' work and more of the events. bayoflife.net. You can get copies of the book there as well, if you don't want to carry them home from here. One more image. After that fire in Big Basin, we went in. It was tough to watch. And then the redwoods came back. They started resprouting from their base, from their crowns, even from their trunks. That's resilience. They were prepared for the fire. Are we? Are we able to cope with changes that are happening in our lifetime? I'm not so sure about that yet. Well, let's take our cue from the world of nature and apply it to our own lifestyles so that we can achieve a better balance, and practice what you preach with your photography and how you apply it. Work with others. Apply a sense of purpose, establish a sense of place, develop your sense of community. We're stronger together. Thank you.